Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Red Pill, joined as always by Dr. Benway, hence the name. And we're going to be talking about depression. Yeah, depression, mental health. Yeah, bring it on. Bring on the cure. Yeah, we're going to get healthy. We're going to get happy. And if not, we'll take enough drugs that will make us happy. Benway, how's it going?
It's going fine by me. I don't know. Have you taken your uppers for the day?
Yes. I took them. I took like a whole fistful, Prozac and all kinds of stuff, and I'm just like happy as a clam. And I have no sensation whatsoever in my groin area, but other than that, I feel fine.
Well, remind me to avoid you in the next 12 hours as you begin your downward trajectory once you get off. In all seriousness, the idea for discussing this topic came, oddly enough, after I was watching the recent series of videos Millennial Woes had put out on his channel, talking about why he kind of been away, and he started talking about kind of the earmarks of a very serious kind of depression that I've seen in other people, that I had a very short period of experiencing myself. The idea that you get in such a frustrated kind of funk that you can't bring yourself to do just basic things, and activities. And the idea started talking about, well, how does one manage through this? How should one manage through this? And how are you expected to manage through this? Would be a potentially interesting conversation.
Yeah, I've had that experience multiple times in my life where I just cannot seem to motivate to do basic tasks. I notice it that, my living area becomes messier and messier. I mean, there are two reasons that my living area becomes messier and messier. Number one, I'm just doing a lot of activities. And number two, I'm not doing any activity. And it's usually symptomatic of one of those two. If I'm doing just a lot of work, I'm just getting a lot of things done, I don't care about the mess in my studio space or office space or whatever. But when I realize I'm not actually doing much, and my place is messy, that's when I start to worry. That for me is sort of like the gauge of where my mood is at and what I should do, because it's inevitable that you go through slumps in your life, like depressive slumps. I think it's just a part of life. And especially, it happens especially when you feel that you're living the myth of Sisyphus, right? Just pushing up a boulder every day, giving it your all, and the next morning the boulder's at the bottom of the hill, and you have to start up all over again. I think that feeling of not powerlessness, but of prolonged frustration is a source a lot of times of depression. And I've noticed too that kind of depression hits people who are more capable and energetic, And my solution, I don't know about you, Benway, but my solution has always been to pivot. When I get stuck, I pivot. I pivot towards something completely different. Some activity or some project that just uses different parts of my brain and allows the part that is getting depressed to rest, to take a back seat. And as I pivot towards doing something radically different, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter how mundane it might be. Just pivoting away from the problem tends to solve the problem and tends to solve the depression. But that's me. I mean, that's how I work. What about you?
Well, before I start getting into solutions, the point I first want to do is make an assessment of what I think often kind of happens when you're in this state. And I think for me, when I've seen it in others, when I've seen it in myself, is a severe case of self-imposed frustration as opposed to just dealing with frustration. Yes, it can be induced by the outside world imposes some shit upon you. You leave your job, you lose your job, you lose a relationship. Usually those things just kind of start it. What perpetuates it is the self-imposed frustration. I'll give you an example from my father, who went through a pretty bad state of depression around the time that he was in college. He actually didn't finish college because he was in this big state of depression in the middle of it. And there was an example that I can kind of summarize it, which was his professor recognized what was going on and said, look, just turn in some paper. I don't care what you write. It could be complete shit. I'll give you an A because I know you're smart and capable. the paper doesn't really mean anything. My father couldn't even bring himself to do that when he was literally guaranteed that he'd get an A no matter what, because it was a self-imposed critique. Somewhat similar for myself when I went through a period. But I think for me, the biggest sign that something was up is when I couldn't maintain a consistent sleep schedule. I was completely off board on everything. I was up, and I normally am an early morning person, but I was like up late at night all the time. So my take on that situation, since it's really a self-imposed critique, because you're always your own worst enemy, is to do things that don't involve me thinking about myself. So frankly, this simply involves taking any form of activity. I've always been the type of person who doesn't actually like spending large times just thinking of myself as an object, discussing it, sharing with other people.
Yeah.
I usually try to exist outside of it.
Yeah, me too.
To the extent it's possible.
Yeah, I agree. What happens to me, look, I recognize something about myself that can be very dangerous, is that I have the ability to focus to a remarkable degree on one particular task for months, potentially years. And that power is very useful in many ways, but it can be also very, very damaging if you don't succeed, because you keep on grinding and grinding away, or at least I do. I keep on grinding and grinding at a problem until I blow a fuse. I mean, I've never actually blown a fuse, but a few times in my life I felt close to it. And so what I realize is that I have to, this drill of my mind, of my attention, of my focus, it sort of like never stops. And so what I have to do is just redirect it in ways that might prove fruitful when the primary goal is just not effective, is not giving any kind of satisfaction. There's no reward, right? Because think of it as just like, just bashing your head against a wall. There are some walls you can break through, right? If they're made of drywall, no problem. But if it's made of like, rebarred concrete, forget it, right? So what I found that I have to do is that I have to just find dry walls to bash my head in and, make holes through them, right? Whenever the primary thing that I want is not achievable or I am not achieving it, okay? That often involves hobbies and pastimes that often is not proved very fruitful, because just about everything I've ever been involved in has started as a hobby, any kind of business that I've been involved in. I mean, you do have to keep in mind, for those of you who don't know, my situation is that I've always been an independent. I have never had a boss, or let me rephrase that. Last time I had a boss was, the first few months right out of college when I was a temp worker. That was the last time I had a boss. I just don't function with authority. I hate having a boss. I much prefer to be my own boss, and make my own mistakes, because I hate that feeling of having my fate in somebody else's hands. That's just me. That's the way I am. And so I've always been independent, and every business I've been involved in, every project that has turned into some sort of money-making venture has always started as a hobby. It's always been something that I thought, oh, this is cool. I never thought to myself, how can I make money? That's never been my approach. There are some people who actually have that approach, and they're successful at it, and good on them. It's just not my approach. My approach is always to turn my pastime into something that pays for itself and eventually might make money. And if it does make money, well, how do you maximize that income, right? But to go back to the problem of depression, I think that for me, it's frustration. Frustration is what leads to depression. Frustration in the sense of not getting what I want and relentlessly trying and failing to get what I want. Sometimes that has expressed itself to me in just inactivity, in that, I tried and tried and tried and I'm getting nowhere, and I sort of like just, the days pass and I don't get anything accomplished. Sometimes I go through periods where I read a lot. That's when I know that I'm in trouble many times, when I'm reading obsessively. I mean, I'm talking obsessively, like I've caught myself sometimes walking and reading at the same time, because I just do not want my I don't want to hear my own head. I want to hear somebody else. You know what I mean? The voices in my head are too loud. But no, seriously, on a serious note, it's sort of like that. I just want something else to suck up my mind because I'm just very unhappy, and my thoughts just keep buzzing and buzzing over the same thing. And so that's why I start reading obsessively and like just relentlessly, you know. But what about you?
Well, I think what you've just kind of described, actually, I think of things a little bit slightly differently. I think a lot of the frustrations people prone to depression tend to have is when they find themselves in situations where they're really not obliged to anybody other than their own ego.
Hmm.
And you're in that situation effectively, as everybody always says, you're your biggest critique, you're your biggest critic. If you're creating whatever, or you're doing something to satisfy no one but yourself, well, you're always going to be in this constant mood of, well, it's not good enough or it's not perfect. And it's largely a byproduct of no one just telling you, you have to produce, you have to keep going, you have to kind of show something. And frankly, I think some of the worst bits of depression I've seen in people are generally in those situations where they just don't have the urgency of obligation. I think if you actually were doing these things in a business where you had a deadline, you'd soon come to the conclusion that I just have to get this out. And you'd eventually reach a point where you said, hey, I know some of the things I produced were good. They got the good marks, they got the outcome I wanted. Some of the things were not so good. But you had the forcing mechanism to kind of keep you connected. And I think a lot of what this depression, my experience, tends to show, it's a manifestation of your disconnectedness with people. So whenever I see people say, well, it's a chemical imbalance, take the pill, well, you're not really
No, that's just
resolving that
yeah.
connectedness or disconnectedness situation. You're just dealing with symptoms.
Well, I'm okay. Two things. Number one, you and I agree on the whole notion of chemically ameliorating your depression. You're just solving the symptoms, not the problem. So screw that. Where we not disagree, but I have a different vision is I think that there are multiple ways at arriving at depression. It's not just a one track that leads you to depression. You're depressed for various reasons, and it doesn't really matter why. Um, how could I put this? The urge to solve the quote unquote depression by way of chemistry, I think it's a horrible thing. I understand how it's happened because pharmaceutical companies make a great deal of money off of Prozac Nation, and it's also from the point of view of the people, it's a very nifty way of unburdening themselves of the responsibility of their depression. Because the thing that I've noticed, of course, and most people have noticed, is that in times of stress, of great stress, like I don't know, war or whatever, or some big disaster, nobody's ever depressed. you know, in Chile, like I've mentioned multiple times on this podcast, in 2010, I was in the middle. I was in Santiago, on the 15th floor, on what was it, February 27th, 2010, when an 8.8 earthquake hit. It hit the 8.8 was at the epicenter, but in Santiago it was 8.3, right? And I was on the 15th floor. Okay, so you can imagine how it moved, right? It was unbelievable, right? And the thing is, see, at the time I was not at a happy moment of my life, to tell you the truth. But and I could argue that I was sort of depressed. The fact of the matter is, I was awake when it happened. It happened at 3:30 in the morning. I was awake at the time, and it was not a particularly happy time of my life, right? For various reasons I'm not going to get into. But the point is, when it hit, the fear and the electricity of the moment, right, jolted me out of any unhappiness. I was pretty happy after that. I was psyched. It was like a big adventure, you know. Yeah, it was the earthquake itself was frightening. But I tend to be in that kind of situation. I tend to be fairly fatalistic because I recognize it's a power far beyond my control, and so there's nothing I can do. I will either live or die. At the time, I thought to myself, the building might collapse or not. There's nothing I can do, so I might as well just enjoy it. And I thought that at the time. But the point I'm trying to make, which is a serious one, when you are suffering great strain or stress, that forces you to react to your environment, whatsoever that stress or strain might be, it squeezes out the depression out of you. And I think that people who have been in just those quote unquote traumatic experiences, they feel happier because of it. It's because it's sort of like a reset, you know? It forces you
Well,
to like reset your whole thing.
well, as I mentioned earlier, it's a I think that's obvious, honestly, and clearly in my mind, a reintegration of you to your environment and your community. Look, any number of things can put you into a state of depression, but we don't define depression, or at least I don't, just simply by the mechanism that got you there. You're in a state of depression
Right.
in a continuous way. It's
Yeah.
like I am depressed, and I'm not just sad for a day. It's a long period of time,
Yeah.
and that you have an active role in that, and that role in maintaining the depression is basically through the isolation of yourself from a lot of these important contexts. Like you said, the jolt of this earthquake, you can't just help but say an earthquake happened and I'm in this vicinity with other people who've experienced it. Suddenly I'm back into the game, whether you know it or not. And yeah, you have other traumatic events to kind of work through to a certain extent, but it's no longer a pure isolation aspect anymore. And I think that's kind of like the key to the matter. Depression in my mind feels, whether you can chemically find, causes for it, and I think in some people they do need chemical treatment as part of a process to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless of kind of the immediate causes, it does feel like it has a social character. Even it's an antisocial character, but it's a social character. You've created a situation where I'm just not a part, and I don't have a place, and it's just me critiquing me. And you don't want to be there.
Yeah, I think that this notion of depression is more endemic in the kind of society we're currently living in, which is so atomized. We're all individuals. We're all homo economicus and just like consuming little robots, right? Consuming little NPCs. And I think that depression befalls people because there's not a sense of community dependence. Because I've noticed that in communities where there is interconnectedness and mutual dependency, like in poorer communities, like, I don't know, African Bushmen or whatever, there isn't that much depression because too many people are counting on you for whatever, right? Yeah, you could be depressed, but you got to go out there and hunt the woolly mammoth or whatever the hell they're hunting, right? You're depressed, but you got to take care of the kids and you got to go out and gather up food from the bushes with all the other women, right? When the community around you is demanding things of you, you can't afford to be, or you can't. I was about to say you can't afford to be depressed. No, but it's not that. It's like it distracts you out of your depression. That community, the community demands distract you. That seems to be what I've noticed, at least, and that our atomized living, our individualistic living, since you are able to just get anything you want just by zipping the credit card, and you don't have any demands on you, you start thinking of yourself and you just spiral. That's what it seems to me.
It seems that you also could live in a society that enables you to participate in your own depression. By that I mean, think of the situation, like you said, in a poor country where there's no social safety net and everybody's kind of in it. You really can't afford to be depressed. To your point, is you have a role to do, and in some sense, having that role mitigates against depression because you have a function. You actually matter to people, which is always an alleviating factor against the feeling that depression, which tends to be, I don't matter to a single goddamn person or to myself. In some sense, living in a society with a social safety net, which simultaneously says you don't really have a part in society, but we're going to give you enough financing so you won't die not doing anything. We'll just give you enough liquid to persist in this idea that you're stewing in your own juices.
Yeah.
That's the worst element. And I actually, that's the reason, like I said, the Millennial Woes videos prompted this to me, is that I think he kind of recognized it, which was there was a situation where you're not allowed to participate in certain civics, social organizations, in part because they don't like your politics. But will also not kill you outright.
Yeah,
you'll just.
Can you go in a little bit into Millennial Woes videos, because I haven't seen them? Okay.
There's a whole series of videos he did. I won't go into all the details because it's just worth watching for your own sake if you're interested. But it's it clearly started out as his kind of frustration with the status of the channel as is. This is post Twitter ban, post a few events that I think were catalysts to starting off this period of depression. But it was trying to explain that period when he just did not feel the energy to even create videos. There was a certain degree of critique with the political movement as such. He wants to do other things, but the nature of being in the position that he is, in terms of topics to cover, just people tend to want one kind of thing versus he wants to do multiple other kind of things, and it kind of leads to self-criticism and stagnation. And I see within him the personality that would maintain that that depressive mentality, which is I'm the piece of shit at the center of the universe, self-criticism kind of thing. So I don't feel in place with everything, but it's just me to critique myself. And so, yeah, that's kind of in part of the discussion. He was brought up this concept, which was I could, in theory, join one of these social clubs that exist in the local community. But if they were to find out who I am, my politics, what have you, I'd be asked to leave. So in some sense, the society is demanding that he has no place in it, but it's also not outright, seeing that he dies. It's basically allowing him enough to subsist and essentially do nothing but brood. And that's as far as I'm concerned, the fuel and the makings of a depressed life, a mentality, and that forces you to stay there.
Well, it's also the ingredients for a terrorist. You get to a point where you feel so isolated and you feel that you are being ostracized just because of your politics and what you think, that you start resenting the society and deciding that you're going to act against that society in some individual way that would express itself by way of violence. You know what I mean? Of course, I'm not saying that Millennial Woes is going to be a terrorist. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying, from that point of departure, that, it makes sense that people would resort to violence to feel some sort of connection, to feel some sort of, that it matters. Because, look, the whole issue of deplatforming that has been going on with the right as of late, and we've talked about it a number of times, the whole issue of Ethan Ralph and Millennial Woes getting banned from different sites and all the rest of it. Yeah, I think that this is, how could I put this? This is just going to make people depressed, but also people who are depressed like this are going to start getting radicalized because they want to avoid being depressed. Because I think that you're right. The whole notion of depression is this lack of human contact. But I think it has to do with demands on your time and effort. Like that you need the surrounding community to demand of you to participate.
Because the truth of the demand is, yes, on one, and this is the complicated nature of the human brain. On one sense, a demand feels like, oh, I'm a slave to someone's dictates. You got to be here at a certain time. It feels like, hey, I'm not my own individual, man. But
right.
That's a very simplistic reading. Another way to read that is someone saying, I need you.
Yeah.
And to be needed is important in the human mind. It feels like I actually have purpose and goal. In fact, why you see people perhaps prone to terrorism in some instances, I can't say all, but certainly some, is a manifestation in a very violent way of saying, I have found some sort of meaning and it's going to attack this thing, but it's a meaning all the same. And certainly creating a situation where, such and such people have no place in our society, but we're also not going to outright kill them. It's like, well, I wonder what you could potentially create as a result of that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. It's just a powder keg. It seems to me that, like, for instance, this thing with Gavin McInnes, he's being, chased off of the online world, right? Gavin McInnes is a very energetic man. He's a very smart man. He's a very popular man. There are a lot of people, the very fact of the Proud Boys, right? Call them whatever you will. I mean, I personally think that, the optics are not good because the Proud Boys sounds kind of, and they call themselves Western chauvinists, right? It sounds vaguely, neo-Nazi-ish, right? But like a guy like Gavin, right? He's getting squeezed out, pushed into the margins. There is a sense that he could basically come to a point of saying, fuck it. I wasn't really radical before. Now I am going to be radical because what do I have to lose? I've been squeezed out of the society that I'm trying to influence that I'm trying to participate in, that I'm trying to push in a direction that I think is better, but this society is so squeezing me out that I might as well, instead of just like gently trying to nudge it, I'll just start kicking it hard. And oh, there's a stiletto there. Maybe I'll just stick the stiletto between the ribs of this society. You know what I'm saying? And I think that the whole notion of just pacifying everybody, as opposed to, integrating them. All right, wait, hang on a second. I gotta rethink what I'm trying to get at here. But I mean, let me just pause right there. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, save me here.
While you're saying this, let me take this moment to iterate what I think is the ultimate. We've talked about this on a previous episode, but to me, the ultimate powder cake for the destruction of society is the concept of the universal basic income. Because the universal basic income is simply at large scale what I just described going through, someone in a depression is going through. You have no place in the society. We can't give you a job. We can't say that you matter to us. But we're also just going to give you enough to survive because, hey, we're humanitarians in that regard. You're just going to fuel the depression.
Yeah.
To no end.
Yeah.
On a massive scale.
Yeah.
In some sense, that's what, the welfare state is effectively doing.
Well,
I mean, because I always said, like, with, the Catholic notion of work, it's not saying that charity is unimportant. Charity has its place. But the goal ultimately, even in Christian theology, is that it's important to work because work gives you meaning and purpose and makes you a part of the society. It has nothing to do with, you should get, you shouldn't get X money because you're, a little peon. That's not really the whole point of that notion that everybody should be working. It's something more psychological than that. And I think, what these, so-called tech geniuses who seem to really love the universal basic income just fundamentally don't understand humans. I mean, I guess it's just the nature of their personality types. But it is funny to me that they have the personality types that should perhaps sooner be aware of that kind of mentality than others, but I guess they're not that clever.
Well, my thinking is that I've always been opposed to any kind of welfare state. I think that the whole notion of the Bismarckian welfare state should be just thrown out the window, because in my own case, I can say that when I've scrambled to survive have been the moments I felt most alive. They've been the happiest of my life. I've mentioned on several opportunities that when I was in Dartmouth freshman orientation week, I was accused of sexual assault. I was accused of trying to forcibly kiss a girl, for those of you who are interested. Anyway, I was suspended for 3 terms, right? I didn't have a place to go. I was living in the United States, but my family was not in the United States. I didn't have any family in the United States. I didn't have any home in the U.S. I had no place to go. And so I had to scramble. And the scramble was quite an odyssey. And it was, quite terrifying for me at the time. I was a fairly sheltered young man. I'd had my scrapes and adventures and so forth, but not like that moment where I was basically had no money, had no place to go, no job, no nothing, no place where I belonged. And I had, like something like 48 hours to clear out of the college I just arrived at. Because for all intents and purposes, I'd moved back to the United States to go to college, but it was a foreign country to me. I hadn't lived in the United States at that time for almost a decade. And when I'd been living in the United States previously, I'd been a child, and here I was as a very young adult with no experience. And so it was really, really challenging. It was the best time of my life, retrospectively. Sure, it was scary. Sure, I didn't know what I was doing, but I managed to find a way. And that made me feel alive. Now, had I had like everything nice and tidy and social services would take care of me and I'd get an EBT card that I could go down to the store and buy food with, yeah, sure, it would have been better at that time, sure. Retrospectively, it would have been disastrous because the experience I had taught me so many things about myself and taught me that I was much more resilient than I thought I was. And it taught me also that the quote-unquote end of the world is not really the end of the world. It's just an inconvenience. And you can muddle through and get by and make it, And so these valuable lessons that have stood me very well indeed over the decades, I would not have learned them had there been like some mommy state there with the EBT card and I would have just sulked. You and I have talked about, there's this individual, this YouTuber, whose situation I know, he's basically on an allowance from his family, and he's made a hash of his YouTube career. And I know what he's doing. He's just sitting at home doing nothing except LARPing. And he's in the middle of a profound depression. And he doesn't even know it, right? Because he's not going out there and facing the problems that you have. If you have a mommy state that is always protecting you, if you have the enormous teat of the state feeding you, well, it's a drugged milk, if you will. It's a milk that will harm you in the end. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think there's truth to a large part of it. I don't want to take this to the extreme of say like there will be no, or I wouldn't want to take it to the extreme that there is under no circumstances where it wouldn't help anybody under any circumstances because they just got to learn by lessons. Oftentimes, I think those are stories told by people who frankly have money in the family that they can back up on, and so they always convince themselves they were self-made when they weren't. But I think the reality of the situation fundamentally, though, is that yes, you can very easily create a situation where you just reproduce, the situation where you just don't have to challenge yourself. You're locked alone with yourself. I think, again, we not too long ago it was the Halloween season. I'm reminded H.P. Lovecraft, before he actually started writing in earnest, had 10 years where he literally locked himself in a room and did nothing except read substantially. But the first thing that got him out of that was when he started writing for basically amateur journalism. He really wasn't making any money doing it, but it was something that he was doing, something that was out amongst other people,
right,
frankly. And that was what saved him from probably killing himself. I mean, I could easily have seen this as a guy who would just end it in that kind of way, but it got him out, and it was just something to do. Something where people said, you did something that I actually want to see. I expect to see another article by H.P. Lovecraft come whatever the deadline may be. It doesn't really matter. That's, I think, the key aspect to this. And I think the problem for me is when I do see people in a state of depression, it's hard to impose that on them. That idea that like, not only do I want you to do something, but I'm going to create a situation where I feel like I want to give into them the necessary obligation, right? Because it's not enough to just say, hey, I'd like to see another video from you. And you say, okay, I'll get to that, because you're still your own boss at that point. It's more like, you owe me another video in 2 weeks. You're going to make it happen, kind of thing. That's probably what you need to get out of there. You need some sort of imposition or some sort of fire under the seat.
Well,
it can come in many ways, but
I think that there's a difference, because some people don't need an external fire under the seat. Some people just their imaginations are captured by some activity, and they're just self-starters. But I would say that most people, they do need a fire under their seat, right? But my thinking has always been like, if we were living in a society whereby there was no social safety net, then out of fear, we would start to depend more on one another. Out of fear of the unknown of the future. I look at the Amish communities, and they live that way. They live that way, whereby they don't depend on certain mechanisms and technologies that the rest of society does. Like we were talking about it at some point, I forget the conversation, but insurance.
It was with Patrick Deneen.
Yeah. But it was the issue of insurance, right? And they deliberately decided not to use that technology, because insurance is a technology. It's a contractual technology, if you want to call it that. And they decided not to live like that, precisely so that they feel that dependence on their community to make them whole if there is a catastrophe is more important, because those social bonds, the societal bonds, that caring for one another is a powerful thing. It's an important thing. And I think that,
and that's a key distinction, because there isn't no net in the Amish community.
right.
The net is the community. The net is not, as it is today, a bureaucratic process.
Right.
Devoid of all human connection.
Yeah. I look at that, and I find it very attractive, to tell you the truth. And I think that a lot of people who are quote unquote depressed now would not be depressed under those circumstances. I look at women especially because my thinking, it seems to me that it seems clear, at least anecdotally, I don't really know the statistics, but anecdotally it seems pretty obvious that women suffer far more from depression, from this kind of like, quotidian depression. And they take all these drugs, Prozac, and I don't know the names of all the other, antidepressive drugs, but they take them by the bucketful. And it seems that the life that they have been encouraged to live is the very source of their misery, of their depression. And it seems just to me absurd that women don't seem to realize this. They don't seem to realize that this this workaholic, this workaholic Tinder life makes women miserable, and yet they live that life. I don't understand it. I don't understand how foolish women are, especially young women who don't have that much time to set themselves up insofar as having a family and kids and the whole nine yards, the things that would actually make them happy. It seems remarkable to me. You know what I mean?
Well, there's been different periods that have caused, seems to me, accelerated amounts of depression amongst women in our society. I think one of the earlier ones, I remember in the 50s when the whole Betty Friedan situation was talking about the bonds of housewifedom. Well, they read that as, oh, it's just marriage is so demanding and cruel that it just creates psychological damage in women. Well, not really. I mean, if you look at what was kind of going on, if you want to cause what was happening, that caused depression amongst 50s housewives, look at what they were selling. They were selling automatic and time-saving devices so that you were just a custodian of some machines that were doing most of the work and rearing for you.
Right.
And to the point where you would just have a lot of free time to do nothing. I mean, there was a joke on The Simpsons when Homer gets a job at the ideal job at a new company that just happens to be run by a James Bond villain, but that's part of the humor. They're in takes control of a fully automated house. All the plants are watered, all the dishes are clean, all the work is effectively done. And then she starts drinking as a result because she has nothing to do.
Right.
And I think that there's what does that tell you? It tells you that not having a function drains you and causes you depression. And if women are prone to depression now, I suspect it isn't even necessarily just that they're in the workforce. I think that it's a situation where, I could be wrong, but my hypothesis is you're in the workforce, and because you being in the workforce is a novelty, rarity, or you as a leader in the company is a novelty, rarity, everybody always says, good job, I'm so happy we have someone who's a woman in charge. You're in a situation where you're doing things, but no one ever really assesses you. You never really are assured of your value. And as a result, you're depressed because it's effectively like, well, I'm doing stuff, but I'm alienated from the whole point of it. In other words, you might as well have been doing nothing.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me there is something, forgive the expression, it's for lack of a better term, there's something caring and loving about being critiqued.
Yeah.
Because it's saying that you're worth my attention to say, this is good, this could be better.
Yeah.
And you should, and more importantly, I'm giving you another shot. I want to come back again and we'll see where we're at. You know what I'm saying? It says you're worth the time of investment. If you're not doing anything, obviously you're not worth the time of investment. But even if you are doing stuff and everybody always gives you the gold star, you're still alienated. It's like, am I really good? The internal dialogue of your brain, because I said the brain, your ego, is always the worst critic of your person there ever is. And if there's a complete disconnect, no one's ever really criticizing you, your brain immediately says they're not paying attention to you. And you know what? They probably don't think you're worth being paid attention to. And thus the ego takes over again. There's no it's almost, you've removed objectivity and all you're left was with solipsism.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking of something else, something that popped into my head. I hadn't thought. It sort of like ties into what you're saying, which I agree. That if you're just being said, "Oh, good job," and it just empty praise is the worst praise, because it might seem polite, but actually it seems to me very dismissive and and vaguely insulting, you know. But anyway, something that cropped to mind that I'd heard was this person, this caretaker. Um, I forget the context of where I heard this expression, but it was great. It was you take care of somebody not because you love them. You love them because you take care of them. That the act of taking care of somebody makes you love them. The act of doing something creates the emotional bond. And when you don't have anything to do, you don't have that emotional bond. You don't have any way to connect to a wider world. You're talking about Marge becoming a drunk because everything in her house is being done for her. Yeah, because when she's doing things in the house, what she's doing is creating a nest for her children. And that activity is creates that bond because she's spending that energy and effort creating this pretty little nest, this tidy nest, all the dishes cleaned and all the shirts ironed and all the rest of it, so that her family can be in her nest and can enjoy her nest, and that gives her satisfaction. And when she can't do that because it's being done for her, and I think it's not just in the case of women and their homes, in the case of homemakers. I think it's in the case of everybody, that everybody, the activity that they do creates the bonds of love and connection with the people around you. Opus Dei, when I was a boy who didn't know any better, I was very critical of Opus Dei. But Opus Dei, the hard right Catholic movement, the whole notion of Esquivada Balaguer was of finding God by way of work. That the activity that you carry out is the way to approach God and the way to approach your community. And I'd never really taken it that seriously before when I was younger. It's not that I didn't take it seriously. Let me phrase that. I was put off by some other relatively minor issues of Opus Dei and not really paid attention to the actual ideas of the movement. But thinking about it now, it's a lot more powerful and a lot more true. As I get older, I realize that a lot of the work that I do, the things that I do, they make me more loving towards the people in my life because I'm doing it for them. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean that's the fundamental, to me, nature of this situation. That there is a piece and a place in the world for you if you choose to act upon it, and and then the truth of the matter is it's mutual. Other people have to realize that holding people to account is actually part of what reminds them that they have a place in the
Yeah,
world.
yeah,
And it's in which this is why, amongst other reasons, the liberalist political project is like, oh, we're just a series of individuals who just happen to be associated with each other. It's a tragic joke
yeah,
in
yeah.
that regard. I mean, notion that, like, oh, because if we're all just individual, I can make or break my relationships with you at will,
Mm.
and I have no true sense of obligation to anybody. It's almost the opposite. You had mentioned, when you had mentioned that, like, the act of caring for someone creates the situation of love. It almost reminds me of Pascal was very famous for his wager on the existence of God, but he also, the other thing he said, I'm going to paraphrase it in a way that we colloquially would understand, which is, oh, how do I find God? Fake it until you make it.
Hmm.
Go through the process of participating in the church, going through the prayers, um, doing all of the kind of expected exterior manifestations of faith. And by doing that and eventually being in that communication with the divine, you will eventually internalize it and it will be there for you. Like I said, fake it till you make it. It's the same thing with relationships. You can fall in love with someone by virtue of being in the position whereby you are with them, just doing things. In some sense, an extreme version of it is Stockholm syndrome. I mean, I'm being somewhat ridiculous, but to prove a point, what is Stockholm syndrome other than the close manifestation of being with someone and recognizing an actual relationship exists there, where you're kind of both dependent on each other in a twisted kind of way, but it manifests the same kind of logic. That's the reality of the situation. I mean, I think the liberalists just refuse to understand that there is a mutual creation of the human psyche going on in the world, and that you cannot just simply will your way from one point to the next all the time. It's not a collection of islands that can or cannot raise the drawbridge at will. Sometimes you just need to, man the fuck up and be with other people and recognize that you need them as much as they need you. Sorry, that went off on a rant there, but it's been something that's been bothering. It's been bothering me a lot with liberalist attitudes, classical liberal attitudes, libertarian attitudes, even just generally liberal attitudes for a while now, which is this notion that, the individual based understanding of the world is best. Because I look at depression and I say, well, this is liberalism in its logical conclusion.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's the individual taken to its logical extreme, disassociated, alienated, just like a floating balloon, untethered to anything. That's depression. That you feel that you're just unconnected, disassociated from everything. And that's why I was mentioning when there's a crisis, when there's a catastrophe. I mentioned that earthquake that I had, right? So right after it happened, I lived in this building, right? And there was basically it was one apartment per floor, and it was a fairly a well-off building, I suppose you could say, and many of the people were elderly, and so I didn't see many of these people for a long time, right? Because I just didn't pay attention to them. I was off in my own little world doing whatever I was doing, right? But after the earthquake, of course, I didn't go down the elevator. I went down the staircase because, after an earthquake, you never get in an elevator. An elevator could have been thrown off course. You can actually get in serious trouble if you get in an elevator after an earthquake. So I went down the staircase, and I was knocking on every door on the way down because I lived on the top floor of this building. I was knocking on every floor to see if the people there were okay. And with each of these people that I'd knock on the door, these elderly people, we'd stop and commiserate and like, oh wow, that was really big, really powerful. And of course, these older people who had lived through several earthquakes would start reminiscing about the earthquakes from right, and it would be like a very communal experience, and I would remind them not to get in the elevator, and they would say, "Oh yeah, we know." Or actually, in one case, the lady had forgotten about that; she was about to get in the elevator, and so anyway, there was that interaction, and that necessary interaction, and that sense that we're all on this boat together, right? And because they were elderly, and because it was some of these people lived on the 10th floor, 12th floor, and they were elderly. They couldn't walk up and down these stairs, but I could. And so I told them, look, I'll get to the bottom, find out what's what, and come back and tell you, and that's what I did, over the course of the next few days, while they checked the elevator and had to actually repair it. I'd go up and down, and I'd knock on the doors of these people and tell them what's what. For a couple of these people, I went and got them some foodstuffs because they were just they could not go. It was just not possible for them to go. It was just 2 or 3 days. It couldn't have been more than that. But there was this connection of dependence, and I was glad to help them. I never felt, I got to help this old biddy, and buy her some apples and potatoes or whatever. I never felt that. I was like happy to help. It was like no trouble at all, and it gave me a measure of satisfaction.
And here's the other thing that's a byproduct of this. Despite this notion that, if I free the individual from unwelcome relationships, everybody's happier. I think the reality is when you're forced to be with people, you mitigate against the possibility, or it's not that it's impossible. You reduce the possibility of being cruel to people for the sake of cruelty.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
when you're kind of forced to just live with people and be there and kind of be accountable
Yeah.
for things in your place, it's very hard to just treat people intentionally like shit because not the least of which you're just physically there.
Yeah.
You have to be present for it. It was that whole joke that you've seen online about, yeah, all of these bitter fights that you see on Twitter or on YouTube comments, whatever the social media setting is. These people were in the presence of each other. They'd kind of whimper like cowering dogs because it's hard to do that. And I think one of the things we just increasingly feel is true is that you're just much less harmful to people when you just have to be responsible
Mm.
for each other.
Yeah.
And I just this notion that you're liberating yourself from
No.
something cruel like the family or like unwelcome social connections, that's a lie. I mean, not to say that it's 100% perfect. I mean, yes, you can be cursed with a shitty family, or yes, you could have a next door neighbor who's a complete asshole. But nonetheless, you more often than not, if you are actually engaging with your neighbors, it's hard for them to be an asshole to you as much as you to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, in those more isolated communities, like up in Alaska, I've been to Alaska, right? And there's a sense that, everybody's got to help each other out. I remember more than once when I was in Alaska, I was driving around and Land Rover with my dog, right? And I'd stop and take pictures and what have you. And more than once, I'd stop someplace and some truck or some pickup truck or something, some guy would stop by or slow down and, roll down the window and say, "You okay?" And I'd say, "Oh, yeah, I just like taking pictures. Thank you so much." But it was a standard thing. The first couple of times it happened to me, I was kind of like weirded out. But then I started realizing, yeah, it's the middle of fucking nowhere. Okay? If a car is stuck here, you're going to need some assistance. And so that's why they're stopping, because they figure, well, you stopped, maybe he needs my help. And that was something. That was something very powerful.
And you don't even have to be in a small community. It used to be in Chicago. I remember people would notice this, especially East Coasters. In Chicago, let's even make this more believable in the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
If you made eye contact with someone that you did not know, you literally had no idea who this person was, you would invariably smile and say hello. It was just maybe this is a Midwestern thing. You don't do that in New York.
Oh, no.
Right? I mean, if you did that in New York, people would think something's fucking wrong with you.
Yeah.
That's their loss, not mine.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I do believe that. I mean, there is this notion like, hell, you know what? This person I don't know on the street, you're worthy of my attention to say hello, how are you doing? Or, hey, you seem lost. Can you need some help here? Or, oh, your car is stalled. Let me give you a jump or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's an acknowledged shared world that you live in.
Yeah. And like, I'm thinking of that New York is in a very real sense the individualistic city. Nobody cares about anybody. It's just everybody's off on their own. They're just a collection of, of atoms of a noble gas. They can never, it's like helium or what's the other? Yeah, helium, right? Or argon, or those individual atoms that can never couple with anything else. They're always going to be virgin atoms. Yeah.
The far right column of the periodic table.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's like a collection of argon atoms. That's what New York City is. And you can never make any connection except the most fleeting kind of business connection. And any kind of social connection that you might have is just completely superficial. And it's just such a bizarre city. I mean, like, I miss it. And on the other hand, I'm kind of like, no, I don't want to go there. Because it's fun for a while. It's a lot of fun to be like this totally individualistic thing floating through New York City. It's a lot of fun, and you can go through all kinds of levels in the city, because the city is so much an issue of like levels of like how many floors in the building, right? But socially and culturally, there are different levels too. There's the highfalutin levels and the mid levels and the down and dirty levels, and you, as an atom of argon in that city, you can go everywhere. That's the weird thing. You can float. I mean, it's no accident that so many punk artists wind up later, hanging out with like the highfalutin celebs because you can float
Mm.
everywhere in that city. That's the remarkable thing, which is pretty cool. But it's it's a how can I put it? See, the fact that most people in New York are running to stand still insofar as income is concerned, and you have to work so hard in order to just maintain, I think keeps people from being depressive and suicidal. If people had like a basic income in New York City, say, there'd be a lot more suicides. I would guess like something like 5% of the population would off themselves per year. You know what I'm saying? It's the very fact that it's so difficult that keeps the loneliness and isolation from eating those people alive with depression. But in other places where that mentality, that of being argon, is more prevalent, and yet it's an easier life. I think that that's the combination. It's the ease of life with atomization, and both of
In
them
other words, Scandinavia,
basically Scandinavia. Well,
because they have the highest suicide rate in the world.
yeah, you're you're right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's funny, this would be another episode, so I don't want to go too deep into it. But it was funny how when you mentioned New York, I immediately and the weirdness of the society there, I immediately thought about, well, the Age of Innocence,
Yeah.
the very famous book by Edith Wharton, and a movie by Martin Scorsese. For my money, his best, but
Yeah,
that's neither here nor there.
very good movie. Yeah.
What was interesting, I thought to myself, oh, New York society, there's a certain kind of odd authoritativeness to it. But the funny thing is, New York now, with all of its social whatever, is still not the New York that Edith Wharton reminisced critically, but ultimately fondly of in Age of Innocence. That's a story where it's a very highly structured society. Yes, it can be conflicted if you're an individualist-minded person, but at the end of the day, I still think that story is about preserving and realizing the value of being in that society with orders, structures, mores, the idea that you all have your role and purpose to play. Ultimately, is more important than than letting yourself go into your individually desired lusts would kind of necessitate that you do. And New York now has not that New York of Edith Wharton. Like I said, this should be its own episode, but since we're talking about depression and your place in society, that came to mind. That it didn't used to be that way, at least in a certain class. It didn't.
Yeah, yeah, but that's kind of like a little bit of a niche situation. Excuse me. The other problem we're having is that, of course, we're living in this age of bounty. We have so much at our fingertips and such an ease of life that because before, yeah, when you were eking out a living, you didn't have time to be depressed, and now the life that we live, it's just so rich, and there's so many people who have access to riches that 100 years ago were unimaginable. I'm not talking about technology. I'm talking about like food, the basics, the things that you need to survive. Because before, a lot of these things, these staples, were luxuries, and now, look at all the fat people. And by the way, I think that the epidemic of obesity over the last 30 years in the United States, yeah, that's symptomatic of a national depression. You only get fat when you only start to overeat like that when you are seriously depressed, when you are seriously unhappy with your lot in life.
Probably true. Yes. I mean, that's the other. I mean, the key thing that maybe is the last note to have on here is that I for as much as I think depression is self-induced,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a socially induced element to it. At the very least, if it's not fully, society causes everybody to be depressed, it certainly isn't helping the matter. I'd at least say that. And yes, we mentioned the over reliance on the welfare state system to never really force you into doing other things, but the uber individualist focus nature on everything. But there's the third element we haven't really talked to directly until this very end, which is we don't have a goal for you. We don't have a big purpose for anyone. The idea that there is such a thing as purpose is already kind of spurious, right? Because if we were to say that there's a purpose for you or a purpose for the society, well, that would be to suggest that there is a set of rules that are better or superior to things. The only thing we are willing right now to say is better or superior to anything else is the fucking society we live in right now. It's like there's nothing outside of this wonderful individually focused liberal society of making a lot of money as soon as you can. So,
Well, it's Machiavellian in the sense of like being very pragmatic about human beings' deficiencies, but not proposing something to strive towards. You know, I mean Machiavellian in that sense. Not the ends justify the means, but in the sense of looking at human beings as people fundamentally with flaws that have to be managed, as opposed to people with aspirations that have to be given an aim. You know what I mean?
well, the only aspirations we allow to give aim towards are fulfillment of immediate pleasure principles.
Yeah, hedonistic. Yeah, the only hedonism is the only aim, which how could I put it? Let's see. When I was young and I started making a lot of money, and I gave into hedonism, if you will, if you want to call it that, and it quickly became very boring. Because there are only so many cars that you can drive at the same time, right? There are only so many clothes you can wear at the same time, and so many parties you can go to at the same time, and you start to realize that consumerism doesn't give you pleasure, and living for hedonism, for pleasure seeking, does not give you prolonged happiness. And actually, it becomes worse because pleasure becomes like a drug, and you're constantly trying to top the last high, and you never can, of course, because as you keep on taking the drug of happiness, quote unquote, you become inured to it. And what really gives you happiness and joy and is striving towards something. That is what we should turn our philosophy back towards the striving, towards a higher ground. And we have yet to figure out a way to do that, to set a North Star, to set a goal, to set something to aim for. We have to start figuring that out. That seems to me what should be our goal.
well,
Ironically enough.
I'm just going to be very explicit about this. I mean, everything we've kind of talked through has been recognized for a very long period of time. We've, in some sense, did a paraphrase / parody of the Confessions of St. Augustine.
Yeah,
everything we kind of just went through
exactly,
completely already depicted in how
1400 years ago. Yeah,
exactly, a few hundred years after the birth of Christ. So, in some sense, this is calling for a religiously minded, however you want to interpret that, society, or at least element to society. At the very least, the religious element of society says there's something a little bit more than your material, the accumulation of your material desires and needs and bits and bobs, right? And that's a key piece that we felt was just too restricting before. We need to get rid of it. I said, well, now we've gotten rid of it and we're more restricted than ever.
Yeah.
We're more depressed than ever. We're fed all the time, and yet we've never been hungry.
Yeah, because we're both depressed, and there's a certain segment of our society that is paranoid of losing control, and so they are becoming increasingly more repressive, which might be a symptom of their depression. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, we're sort of like going down the tubes. It seems as if collectively, as a society, we're in the throes of a nervous breakdown. So let's see how the splatter ends.
Well, maybe in retrospect, we will, if people are thinking of various ages of the world, the age of enlightenment, let's say, if that began with the, say, coming out of the Renaissance through the various revolutions, maybe this past years, let's say the past 100 years and going on, may be referred to as the Age of Depression, because it certainly feels that way.
Well,
I'd say
I could certainly say the last
ever
50
since-
years. The last 50 years.
I would, ever since the bang of World War I think we've been in the Age of Depression.
I have a slightly different view. I tend to think of it as starting with the 60s. I view the 60s as the Great War, the World War I, was a tragedy, and World War II was just a continuation of that tragedy. And then there was the post-war and the shock of it, and just like the realignment of all of Europe and of Western society that happened between 45 and basically the killing of Kennedy, right? That period, those 18 years, it was like a realignment, readjustment after the trauma of 1918, 1945, right? But starting in 63, then you had the Summer of Love and Vietnam, and then the 70s, the doldrums of the 70s, and the me-decade 70s that morphed into the 80s, and then the 90s, which was this weird normcore kind of thing, and the 2000s and 2010s now. We've been going through a depression. It's a depression. Maybe it's the effects of the second 30 Years' War, as the 1918, 1945 could be looked upon. Maybe
Right.
it's something just systemic to liberalism, and that the world wars contributed to it. I think that the Deneen critique is pretty much on the money, but I think that there might be more contributing factors, especially the wars. But look, we don't have to go into the nitty-gritty of it. I think the depression started in the 60s, and also I think that we are failing to recognize the pill. In 1960, the birth control pill was introduced, and I do not think that we have really grappled with that issue. I don't mean the podcast, I mean as a society. We have not faced that issue and really understood what it did and how catastrophic it was to society and to people, to disassociate the possibility of pregnancy from sex. It's not that the sexual revolution was a bad thing. No, I'm talking about more profound issues. I'm talking about the society and how we interact with one another and our goals in life. The fact that the pill was introduced created a society that...
Well, my take is that with the pill was introduced in a society that was prepared for it. By that, it was a society that was prepared to think upon its existence as separate from the idea of having to reproduce itself.
Well, no, I disagree. I think that the pill was the trigger for a lot of things.
I
don't know. I don't know. Let's call it a podcast and continue this conversation, because this is really interesting. But I have to rethink it more, think it more, flesh it out more before I can really talk about it. Yeah, but it's been a lot of fun. Yeah, I hope it's been fun for you guys. So this has been the Coach and Benway podcast. Dr. Benway, would you like to sign us off with a final thought, a final word, a final gesture at wisdom?
I demand that everybody write a comment on this video, and I know exactly all of each and every one of you, and I will expect and frankly demand that comment be on the bottom of this video.
Okay.
Otherwise, I would demand. Otherwise, you'll just be left alone in your devices.
Yeah, and your depression, and you will die in your little room of your depression. Your depression will come out of you like a monster and gobble you up. So write a comment. And on that happy note, we'll catch you later. Take it easy.